The GH6 is inevitably coming. Surely it must be. Panasonic would be silly not to make a GH6, a LUMIX GH6 for that matter. The GH5, the GH4, and the GH5S, all incredibly popular cameras. There has to be a GH6, but people are worried that LUMIX and maybe the Micro Four Third style and that sensor size is just going away. Micro Four Thirds might not be a thing anymore now that Olympus is maybe kind of getting out of everything. Who's left? Well, there's plenty of companies still supporting Micro Four Thirds, and I don't think it's going to go anywhere, at least not for this generation. I think there's still going to be a GH6. So let's talk about what that could look like. I'm calling this my LUMIX GH6 Hypospectacle. So it's a hypothetical specifications. The specs, the hypothetical specs, the hypospectacle, I made it up. I Google searched it. There were 0 results. But I'm going to coin it. I'm going to say it's a hypospectacle. Let's talk about the specs that should be in the GH6, even though we know nothing about it. Let's pretend we do and talk about the LUMIX GH6. It should be 24 megapixels. This is the same as the S1, as the S1H, as the S5, and the GH5 is 20 megapixels. So 24 megapixels would be a worthy upgrade for a GH6 and makes sense given the other cameras in their lineup. Albeit those are full frame versions. This would be the Micro Four Third version, but 24 megapixels. From there, we can pull 6K 60, 10-bit 422, just like the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera 6K. We can do 4K 120, 10-bit 422, just like the A7S III. And we can do 10-bit 422, 1080p 240. This is the specs that I think a GH6 has to have to be attractive. If it's just 4K 60 or just 4K 120, yeah, the A7S III does that, and it's full frame. It needs the 6K 60. I think that separates it. I think it makes it distinct. People might say, oh, well, that takes away from the full frame line. It's like, yes, but if I'm going to go Micro Four Third, I need there to be additional features for Micro Four Third, right? This needs dual ISO. Just like the GH5S, the GH6 needs to have dual ISO. Just like the S1H and the S5, low light capability is incredibly important nowadays, and it's just another reason, especially on a Micro Four Third camera, to go for something like a GH6. When we're looking at a GH6, we have to keep in mind everything else that's out on the market and how it compares, because Micro Four Thirds is looking smaller as a sensor size compared to full frame when the A7S III is doing so much of this stuff in a full frame body. So we have to have things that stand out from Micro Four Thirds that make the GH6 separate and distinct, and I think 6K 60 would be one. We need the great 5-axis IBIS that LUMIX is known for. It's great, the stabilization is fantastic, make it better, but of course keep that in there. And it doesn't necessarily have to be phase detect, but phase detect autofocus or something similar that works just as well for proper eye tracking, face tracking, head tracking, body tracking. We need autofocus that can track everything. It's a smaller sensor. We need to track as much as we can and actually get it in focus in video reliably, 95% of the time, 100% of the time. The LUMIX GH6 needs something better than the DFD contrast system they're currently implementing, even on their new cameras like the S5. It's not enough. It's not good enough. Sony and Canon are winning on this one feature alone, quite frankly. For a lot of people, they need autofocus, they need it to work reliably, and the LUMIX cameras just aren't doing it. The GH6 is the perfect time to introduce phase detect or something similar. Maybe there's something better than phase detect. Do that. But at least something like phase detect. We need to keep Vlog, but I think it's maybe time for like a Vlog 2. And don't give it Vlog Lite or anything like that. No, the GH6 deserves Vlog or a variation, Vlog 2. I mean, Sony and Canon have S-Log and C-Log 1, 2, and 3. Panasonic still has Vlog, which is great, and it's fantastic. Vlog L, though, I don't want Vlog L anymore. I want a proper Vlog and maybe even something a little bit better in Vlog 2. Needs to keep all-eye and IPB recording modes. I don't want it to just be all-eye or only IPB. We need both of these modes for basically every style of shooting. That way, You can pick and choose as the shooter, okay, do you want higher quality and easier edits but bigger file sizes, or are you recording for a long time and you want to kind of trim the file size down and maybe it's a little bit more compressed, but you're willing to deal with it because it's a long recording. Having both of those is really, really important. Keep the dual card slots. This is a great feature on the GH5 that wasn't there on the GH4, needs to be there on the GH6. I don't think we need to go to triple card slots. I think that's overkill, but it definitely dual. Shutter angle. Have to keep shutter angle. If shutter angle disappears, I'm going to be furious. The GH6 has to have it. Needs to keep the flip screen. If they do a tilt screen, I mean, they would be dumb to, because even the GH1 had a proper flip screen a long time ago. Was that over 10 years ago? Had a proper flip screen. Keep it. It is a staple of the GH series. Do not take it away. LUMIX. I'll lose my mind. Audio features. This is one thing I really like about the LUMIX cameras, and maybe I take for granted compared to other cameras like Canon. But there's audio features built right into the GH5, like low cut, limiter, meters. Like there's a lot of nice audio stuff there. Expand upon that, keep it, but don't lose it. We got to keep all this stuff. You got to keep the 8-bit modes too. 10-bit might be too much for some people and they don't necessarily need it. Keep the 8-bit modes as well. Don't just phase them out because you think, oh, those are bad. It's like, no, keep everything we've had before and just add on to it. Keep it the same size. If anything, just the exact same form factor, so no one has to buy new accessories, new cages, nothing. Keep it exactly the same. It's a good size. It's a good weight. Do you want it bigger? No. Do you want it smaller? No. The GH5 is pretty much perfect as is, and people have a lot of equipment and accessories, so keep it the same size. And have the codecs be easy edit. One of the most annoying things about all these hybrid cameras is they have annoying codecs that are just a pain to edit. They slow your computer down. You need to edit on an iPad in some cases for best performance. People are editing on iPads. This is ridiculous. We need easy edit codecs in the GH6 so that you can just take it right from the camera, right into the computer, and you can edit dailies, no problem. Needs to keep the teleconvert feature. This is a feature that kind of gets underrated maybe on the GH5, but the fact that you can kind of convert some of your prime lenses into somewhat of like zoom lenses, or at least having 2 different focal lengths per lens, is a cool feature that should definitely stay. And you have to keep the anamorphic support. It's what the LUMIX cameras are now kind of becoming known for. It's this kind of niche quirk they have that, hey, you can shoot anamorphic on a GH5, or even on an S5 you can shoot anamorphic. Keep it on the GH6. Make it better if possible, but really just having it I think is enough and a unique selling point for the LUMIX cameras. Let's talk about some bonus features. This is where we're maybe reaching a little bit. Everything we talked about before pretty much has to be there. I don't think anything on that, like it has to be that or better. I don't think there's any way that any of those things is removed or lesser than, and the GH6 succeeds. It's got to be all those. And by the way, Panasonic, you're welcome. I'm giving you the blueprint for making the perfect camera. You just do all this stuff, you'll sell them like hotcakes. Here's a bonus feature. It doesn't have it has a micro four third mount, but the sensor size is Super 35. This is something I've talked about for, I don't know if I was the first person talking about this, but since the LS300, the JVC LS300, they put a Super 35 sensor in a micro four third mount, and that camera was awesome because of it. You could use a speed booster and basically get to full frame, full frame look equivalent, more or less close to it, because you have a Super 35 sensor, but you still have the micro four third mount. And people will say, oh no, but all my lenses, what will we ever do? Those lenses can have a slight crop. Like, you punch in a little bit on the sensor, you got to get, maybe my sensor specs are a little bit off. You got to line it up perfectly to where you have enough pixels for Super 35 to where when you crop for micro four third, you're not losing too much resolution. I'm sure the people over at LUMIX are smart and talented engineers. I'm sure they can figure it out. This would be a really cool bonus feature to say, hey, our micro four third camera also has an oversized Super 35 sensor, just like cinema cameras. Isn't that incredible? And then all your adapters, all this stuff just works. You put LUMIX lenses on there, those work fine too. It'd be beautiful. Give the GH6 an internal electronic ND. This is just like they have on the FS5 and the FS7 Mark II and the FS5 Mark II. There's an internal electronic ND. It doesn't have a, a filter scroll. It's small, it's compact, it can fit inside the body. Get an ND in there. We have aperture, we have shutter, we have ISO. We can control our exposure with those three, but there's the fourth, ND. It's the fourth way to control your exposure. Equally as important as all the others. Most of the time you want shallow depth of field, so you're really not playing with your aperture too much. No one is shooting at f16. You're shooting at f2.8. You're shooting at f1.7. You're shooting at f4. That's where you want to be. You go outside, it's too bright, but you're not going to stop down. You don't want to shoot at f18, f22. That's ridiculous. Your ISO, we can go down to 200. Maybe you can go down to 100. Maybe you have a camera that can go down to 50. But realistically, you need to go darker than that. Your shutter, it's 180 degrees. It's locked. You're not playing with shutter speed to control your exposure. Specifically, when you're doing video, you don't have a lot of options regarding those. The only way to control your exposure really for video or for cinema is with an ND filter. So put it in the camera. That way it's there all the time. No matter what situation you're in, you always have it at a moment's notice. Give it HDMI RAW. This is a little bit of a wild card. This is a little bit crazy. You're doing it with the S5. You did it with the S1H. LUMIX, give the HDMI RAW output just because it would be awesome. Why not? It's the GH6. It might be the last Micro Four Thirds camera, at least the last good one anyway. Go all out. Give it HDMI RAW. We need to be able to magnify during live recording. You can punch in, you can double tap on the screen before recording, but once you hit record on the GH5, you can't magnify to check focus during recording. This needs to be fixed. This is something you can do on the Blackmagic cameras, and you can't do it on the LUMIX cameras yet. But the GH6 has to have it where you're recording, and you can double tap, check your focus. It will be awesome. Give it resolution stacking. More of a photo feature, which is great, just like the G9 and the S5. Be able to take those burst modes using the 5-axis image stabilization and stack your resolution. Make these ultra high megapixel photos. Just build it in there. It's basically a software feature at this point. You did it on the G9, you did it on the S5, do it on the GH6. People will say, it's not full frame, it's not full frame. Who cares? We've been shooting with the GH5 for a long time, the GH5S. Beautiful footage from Micro Four Thirds. And guess what? The GH6 should be $1,750. Basically $1,800 should be what the GH6 is. And oh, wouldn't you know, that's exactly half of the A7S III for $3,500. And as we've talked about, this would have better features than the A7S III. Half the price, half the sensor size. I think that makes sense. I think that's fair. I think a lot of people would scoop up a GH6 if it was $1,800, basically half of an A7S III. Hey, you can get two GH6s for the price of one A7S III, and it's just as good in low light. It does 6K 60. It's got the autofocus, and oh, by the way, it's 24 megapixels, not just the measly 12 that you get on the A7S III. And people will scream their heads off and say, but it's not full frame, it's not full frame, it's not full frame. And meanwhile, we're all sitting there with our awesome LUMIX Micro Four Thirds lenses that are small, they're lightweight, they're compact, they're beautiful, and they work great. And we don't have to invest in new glass. If you're a GH5 shooter, you've already got all that lined up. And you say, GH6? Yes. Yes, LUMIX. Yes, Panasonic. Take my money. Here you go. You gave me everything I could ever want. You included all the bonus features, and even then some. I'm sure they're cooking up things behind the scenes that are even more magical than I can describe here. But at least this is a rough blueprint for what they should be doing, because at this point, the S5, the S1H, the full frame, LUMIX stuff, it's all right, but they got to fix that autofocus. They got to do it. Canon and Sony have it relatively figured out. The GH6 is the perfect opportunity to come full force, swinging as hard as they can to really showcase the power of Micro Four Thirds and why it has advantages. Micro Four Thirds being smaller, a smaller sensor, you should be able to do faster reads on the sensor. The lenses should be smaller and more lightweight and still just, as fast. You're not going to have as shallow depth of field, I know that. But in general, taking advantage of those benefits, it's mind-boggling to me that there aren't longer focal lengths for micro four thirds, considering one of the main advantages of a smaller sensor is that you can, it's cropping in. So it's giving you more of that teleconversion just by the sensor itself. So it's easier to shoot at 600 millimeters, you know, with a lightweight 300 millimeter lens. Go crazy, go all out. All the full frame, long, super telephoto lenses for wildlife and sports, they're massive and they're like f11. They're ridiculous. Make some long, make like a, you know, like 500, 600, make it eight, make 1,000 millimeter lens. I don't know. Go crazy, go all out. Tap into the benefits of micro four thirds. Don't try and do just the wide end stuff. We kind of got that with the Leica 10 to 25 zoom lens. That's great. We all know the Sigma 18 to 35 with the speed booster. That's awesome. You got things like you can put a speed booster on these cameras and make them and give you that wider field of view. But go long. You know, reach for the stars, reach for the moon, go crazy. Get some really long glass out there that's fast. I don't want f11. I don't even want f8. You know, f4, 5.6. Long lenses. And I think we'll be good with the GH6. I think there's a lot of promise. I think there's a lot of potential for micro four thirds. The GH5 and the 5S, incredibly popular. Lots of people love the cameras. I love them. I love the GH4 before it, all the way back to the GH1. I love the GH1. And the GH6 could be that kind of final home run swing for Lumix in micro four thirds, because the future probably is full frame, but let's at least get one more, at least one more good one. Make a lot of money. Panasonic, I want you to make a lot of money. Just deliver on some of these features that should be on your radar. If they're not, they are now. Hopefully you watch this video and you know what we're expecting, at least what I'm expecting. And maybe there's something I'm missing, which would be, you know, listen to other people too. Check the comments, see what other people are saying. It's probably too late. You know, the GH6 needs to come out sooner rather than later. In fact, you know, get on it, like announce it real quick. I know you just had your announcement. Lumix S5, hey, that's great. People want to know, where's the GH6? So, time's ticking. Get on it.